Hello, we'd like to welcome you again to another of the BYU Library Family History Center classes. This is How to Read and Understand a Will. I kind of got into this one a little bit on the issue of what I think's kind of helpful to everybody. So I wish that the many people who search for birth, marriage, and death records would just go one step further and start looking for the wills in their research. The wills, as I'll talk about and probably repeat more than once, is that are almost the most valuable genealogical records that we can find because of the way they're structured and the way that they handle the information about the families. So as we get into it, we have to understand that wills aren't as readily available as some BMD records. BMD is birth, marriage, and death. But they usually have more information about the entire family. And the information there is probably going to be more accurate in the sense than some of the other records that are contemporaneous types of records. That's one reason why I think we've emphasized talking about this in the past. One of the things that's helpful is to get oriented and kind of have a map to get to where you want to go with wills, and that's to learn about the content of a will, and then before you try to use them as genealogical sources. It's pretty simple to get started, but it can get pretty difficult. One of the things is, of course, and we have to face that right off, is the jargon. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Jargon is a term that means specialized language used by a group of people sort of together. And the law community is one of those groups, and law has a lot of jargon. And so that means that there are lots of specialized terms. And so we'll kind of get into it a little bit about what to get some basics here. And then we'll also get into exactly how we're going to use this information. So in order for there to be an estate, and when we talk about the estate, that's what we mean that all of the property that somebody owns. And first of all, the laws that in order to have an estate, in order to even begin to have an estate, the country where this occurs, and that's one of those is the United States, it does recognize individual property rights. But there are countries that do not recognize individual property rights. And so having an estate is a not a possible thing to do. And there are no probates and there are no transfers. And whatever happens to the property of an individual when they die has nothing to do with courts or anything else. It usually ends up in the country, in the government. Individuals must have also, and this is second that helps to define what an estate and how whether or not we can have estates. The individuals must have the right to alienate or transfer. Now, the word alienate, there's your jargon term. It means to transfer. It means to sell or whatever. And to alienate or transfer the property to a spouse or others after death. So once they have a recognized property, then they need to have the secondary right to transfer that property to someone other than the state after death. And everything owned by the deceased at the time of the death is in the estate. Some people get caught up in the idea that the estate is like your banking account and what money you have and that, what you call your money. No, every last item that you own or have control over is basically part of your estate. Every piece of paper, every document, every pencil, pen, I mean, anything. There's no limitation. That's all matter. It's all part of the estate. So those are the kind of basic things that have to happen for there to be a any kind of a interest which can pass. So I have a definition of a will, and my definition of a will is a little tiny bit different than the definition that most people use for wills. My definition of a will is that a will is a document created by a person before death that attempts to influence the distribution of that person's property after death. Now, there's a kind of a I mean, I would think it was almost universal that people were saying, oh, if you put it in your will, then it's going to go to that person. And the answer is, don't count on it. The dynamics of families and the dynamics of inheritances are such that after being a trial attorney for 39 years and spending a lot of time in court litigating wills and various inheritance issues, I'll tell you that what you put in your will is mostly a wish. It's not necessarily. You say, well, it's enforceable, isn't it, by law? And I say, well, yeah, it is, but they may disagree with you about what you put and what's enforceable, and they may also set the will aside for any number of reasons. So this is a kind of a situation where I'm not here giving legal advice. I'm not telling people how to have a will. I'm just pointing out the fact that wills can be used for other purposes besides going to court or going through probate. So that's my issue is that wills are very, 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 say that too many times. I can't say that too many times. Valuable genealogical research documents. Here's the common definition of a will. It's a document in which a person specifies the method to be applied in the management and distribution of his or her estate, after his or her death. We today like to be different, so we would probably change this definition to say distribution of their estate after their death, or things like that. But you have to understand the law goes back thousands of years, and it doesn't change very much. And the fact that the society starts changing wording and changing the way they talk about things doesn't usually affect legal documents for many, 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 many years after. So a probate is a legal action or process by which a will is proved to be valid, and that means it's testate. That's another word. Testate means there is a will, and the will is presented to the court, and the court is taking this action. Or if there is no will, that's intestate, how the deceased person's property should be distributed according to law. This is a pretty fair way of looking at it. And if you think about it as a process like this, what happens and why it's so genealogically valuable is that this names, it's the core thing here. You name the people to be distributed to property. And most people are pretty fair, and they name everybody. They may not give very much to one child. They may give a whole bunch to another child. And historically, the eldest son received all the property from the father, or the majority, or almost all. And usually the younger children were kind of cut off from having any major benefit from the person's the parents' estate. But that was sometimes good, because what happened, like for example, back in my time, back when in my ancestors, one of those ancestors left Rhode Island because he was not the oldest child, apparently, and did not get the money under the will. And so he ended up in New York and ended up doing very, very well and became quite wealthy. So it wasn't a totalist problem. It was more of a one way of maintaining the estates. The idea here is if you keep every year somebody died and they split it up into smaller and smaller pieces, then pretty soon it would be totally unmanageable and nobody would benefit by it. So there's a kind of a good reason for why the will was sent to the oldest living uh, male resident. And then the reason why it was the male usually is because it's just the way that society was developed over the years. Here's some definitions. We're getting into some definitions, and these are the kind of things that you need to know even to just barely talk about it. When you're going to go get, if you were to get a will for yourself or some, be helping somebody get a will, this would be the kind of thing you'd hear about all the time. And there's some older terms. This is called a testator and a testatrix. The male designation is testator. The female designation is testatrix. That's the person making the will. So he's a testator, there's a will, and that's the person. Now, if a person does not have a will and they die, the court still has to process the distribution of the property. And then that was the intestate type of situation. And then the administrator is appointed. And these terms have been around for a few hundred years and go way back into the Latin. An executor or executrix, this is the person administrating a estate where there is a will. So the terms kind of change. So you have the testator makes the will, the executor is the person who administers, or the surviving person, obviously. The executor has to be alive in order to do the will, to take the will to court. The language here has changed. Back in about 1972, there was an effort, and there have been lots of efforts to create what are called uniform laws. The reality in a country like the United States and other countries have similar issues is that things like probates were handled on the county level, and there are over 3,000 counties in the United States. And so there are 3,000 different ways of handling probates. And so what was happening was that since there was such a mishmash of rules across the country, some people, some legal academics and administrators decided to sit down and write uniform laws. So there's a Uniform Law Commission, and it's been around for 40 or 50 years. But basically what it does is attempt to get the states to come up with something that looks like the same kind of law. Now, the state that I lived in and was practicing law in was Arizona. And they pretty quick, one of the first people to adopt the Uniform Probate Code, and then immediately began changing it. So it's very, trusts and estates is a kind of a two things together. And I'm not going to go into trusts other than to mention that they are an alternative method of passing your property upon your death. But what we're looking at here is under the Uniform Probate Code, probably most noticeable thing is there were no testators and testatrix or executors. All that language disappeared, and it went into things like personal representative, and that's the simple language. Now, when you're looking at a will, if you go back 200 or 300 years and you find a will for a person, you will find it being exactly in the same format as it is today. And regardless of the Uniform Probate Code, regardless of changes in the way that people call what they call the different parts of the will, these things all have to be as part of the will. And so since there's sort of a formula for creating wills over an extended period of time, this makes them tremendously, and I keep using very large, very important word, saying these are really important. They This is why they're so valuable. It's because it's been used, and all of that information has been preserved in the wills all the way up to the present time. And so they can become a very good thing. And they don't disappear like civil registration in some of the countries in the 1850s, or like some of the other problems. So the two fundamental things uh, in law that are going to be always someplace is um, trusts, wills, the estates, and property law with deeds and all of the kinds of things. These are going to go back to the Middle Ages in almost any country in the world, because there's no other way to do it. And when you're working with property, or you're doing now, when we go back to the beginning, what I said is if there's a country that doesn't recognize individual property rights, then none of this applies, because they don't own the property when they die, and so therefore there's no passage of the interest to in an estate. Now, if you go back in English law, for example, if you're thinking that this would be kind of unusual in a sense, and you're starting to think about other kinds of countries that may do this. Back in the old days, the manors, English manor, when they had the vast holdings of the noble class in England, the people who lived on those properties never had anything to pass in a will. So there's really nothing in wills. The serfs and the people who were living and dependent on that mansion. So you might get a will from the mansion people, but you wouldn't get it from the people working there. The declaration of intent states that the document is intended to be the testator's last will and testament. This is a formality. This is to prevent people from taking lists. For example, someone makes a list and they say, I want this to go to Joe, and I want this to go to Sam, and I want this to go to Fred, and I want this to go to Mary, and I want this to go to Elizabeth. Anyway, no, that's not a will. That doesn't work. This is a requirement, a formal requirement for a will. So it's the declaration of intent states that the document is intended to be the testator's last will and testament. That has to appear somewhere near the beginning of the will to let everybody know that this was something that they wanted to be enforceable in a sense. But like I say, enforceable meant that you could sometimes create fights, and talk a little bit about that. The beneficiary designations outline how the testator wants their assets to be distributed. So this is the core part of it that benefits genealogists. Apart from, there's other things. Some of the things about a will that are very helpful genealogically is this, because they name their heirs, the people who they're usually their children or grandchildren, and sometimes tell their spousal who they're married to. Sometimes they include very lot of detailed information about the family and the family organization and who they are and where they are and all of those kinds of things. So in a sense, becomes a snapshot of the family that can be used for genealogical purposes, because it confirms a lot of the suppositions that we make. So going back in time with a will, if we get back into the 1600s, for example, or early 1700s, it's absolutely necessary to find a will to actually fix down who were the people who were related in this particular area. The reason being the common names and just confusion over who people were related and back and forth. So as long as you've got a family, let's give an example. If we had somebody in the family search family tree, and you go back and they were supposed to have been born in the 15 or 1600s, and they died in the 16 or 1700s, then the chances of them having a will are close to 100%. Whether it was preserved and available and accessible, that's another issue. But back in the early days, everybody had to have a will. It didn't matter how small their estate was. I've seen estates where it was like 10 pins, a saddle, a bowl. That's the kind of things that were, and those, all that had to happen. Anything that was owned by the deceased ended up in a will. And so the will files for all of these different counties around the country are the actual real valuable information places for doing genealogical research. And here's the good news. The good news is some of the wills are online. I'll repeat that later. Some of the wills, some of the information is searchable, and a lot of it is still sitting in courthouses. We kind of mentioning is that my wife and I went on did a church service mission to go to do digitized documents in the Maryland State Archives for Family Search. We spent a year digitizing documents. There were four couples with four different cameras, and we estimated we did probably around 2 million plus pages documents in the time we were there. But in retrospect, and understanding how much information there was in Maryland for that in the probate files, was that we had barely skimmed the surface of the amount of information that was still in the old books and records in the state archives and elsewhere. So this is not something that's is readily accessible. This probably is the prime factor why it's not used too much, especially by people who are just beginning to do their genealogy. Okay, so we've had these three sections, and then there's a section that says appointing the executor or person who is going to take care of all of this. And they're the ones that are going to carry out the terms of the will and manage the estate. Okay, so that's what that happens. All these four things are going to be in wills in some format or another. And that's basically what constitutes a will. So I'm going to repeat this because it's very important that you can't go finding wills when there weren't laws that allowed the alienation of real and personal property on the death. So that's the issue. So when this did not exist, then there were no wills. That's too bad. Well, and another thing, for example, parish registers only start when the parish is organized. So if you keep going back in time, you're going to find out the church records disappear and everything else. So that's just the way that works when you're doing historical research. Okay, so apart from the form and apart from what the wills are supposed to be doing, there's another thing. There's some requirements. I mentioned you couldn't just have a list of names and say, I want Harry to have this and George and Michael and Mary and Sue. And okay, yeah, no, that's not a will. So basically, what has to happen is that the will conform to the legal restrictions in force at the time the will is mailed. That means wherever it is. If it's in England, if it's in Germany, if it's in whatever country, there's still going to be some legal restrictions of what they're going to accept as a will. So when the will is improbated and the heirs come in and they're not happy with each other and they start fighting with each other, one of the tactics is to say the will's invalid for a lot of reasons. It doesn't conform with the legal law of what's necessary for a will. So that's kind of there's lots of this can go on. And that's what, it's what I lived through for years, is just listening to all these arguments being made back and forth. and making my own arguments, obviously. Must be in writing and witnessed. Okay. Or there's an or here. The or is it must be in the handwriting of the deceased. It doesn't have to be witnessed, it just has to be all in the handwriting of the deceased. That's called a holographic will. And if you're getting into that level, you're probably getting into somebody who will contest it for some reason and not be happy with it. So the writing and witnessed would be the formal will, must be in the handwriting of the deceased. That's holographic or handwritten. That holographic means handwritten. And it could be oral if it's witnessed and written down at the time or shortly thereafter, meaning the time the person died or before the person died. Obviously, it had to be before the person died. You can remember. Yeah. Okay. So if it's oral, somebody has to write it down. So as the person speaks it, they copy it down, and then the guy dies, and then the will. They say, "This is the will. This is the will." And then that gets into a lot of discussion. Just for an example, this is the last page of the handwritten 1616 will of William Shakespeare. And it was by me, William Shakespeare, and was written by Shakespeare. So this is Shakespeare's handwriting and his will. And I just showed that because it looks like scribbles. And if you look carefully at this and had it blown up a bit, you could read it after a while of studying how to do the language back then. And it's important to understand, is what I said a little bit at the beginning, was that wills date back thousands of years. And I think they're the most reliable historical documents we can find. I mean, people weren't making stuff up when they were going to die. If they wanted it to go to if they wanted anything to go to their spouse, or if they wanted anything to go to one of their children, or more than, or somebody else for that matter, then they were very careful to say who they wanted. And so it's a way to see that you have a, a family. You can reconstruct the families by these documents in a lot of cases, unless sometimes they omit names. That's because the individuals the children died before the parent died. And so when their parents died, their children were no longer in the will. Obviously, they're not giving it to dead people. And it was very uncommon that they would give anything to the spouse of a dead child. So that's just something that happens. So this is kind of the part that makes it important to understand and to be actually involved in doing this kind of research. So most of the countries of the world have some type of probate procedure to transfer this. So you don't have to say this is basically something in the United States. The question is, are those documents preserved? Are they available? And are they accessible? And that may be the case, that there may be in existence, but they're not accessible, and they're not going to let you look at them. And here's kind of the fundamental: no property, no probate. If your people were poor, and like many of my, not all of my relatives, my ancestors, but out of the hundreds, maybe thousands that I've looked at, I would say that there are very, very, very few of them that have anything that would even be considered to be a sizable estate. They're all pretty poor. But it's interesting because this is in the United States only, and we can't make generalizations about other countries. But some states don't require probate if an estate is less than $250,000. So if everything that's in the value of the property of the deceased doesn't exceed the value of $250,000, then there's no probate. You just distribute it like that, come to an agreement, and somebody gets whatever they want, and sort of thing. What I've seen, and which works extremely well, unless the family does not get along, and then they're fighting with each other, and then there's nothing you can do to stop that. But generally speaking, if the people involved are reasonable and understanding what's going on, they'll just come in and say, "Oh, well, would you like? Everybody gets your choice: first choice, second choice, third choice, whatever," and then everything's gone. And that works, and I've seen that work very, 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 very well with families that had estates that were much less than this amount. That's some of the highest amount that they have. Some of them have like $3,000 and lower than that, some of the states. So the amount varies by state. And then there's states that don't even require probate if there's a will and the will is uncontested. So there's some way you may want to question that from your state. Does it really require a will if the will's if there is a will and the will is uncontested? All you have to do is go in and do that, and then you just go take and distribute it yourself. You don't end up going to court. And unfortunately, almost all states require a probate to distribute real property. And so basically, there's ways to avoid that. Just kind of a mention, there's been a thing that just keeps spreading through the cultural understanding of America, people who live in the United States of America. And that is that there's something really wrong about having a probate on an estate. There's whole industries of estate planners and people like that who kind of self-created this idea that unless you have a will, you're doomed, your heirs are doomed, and all this kind of stuff. Well, you can see that there's lots of times when you don't even need to have a probate or an estate, depending on will, depending on what kind of things happen in your estate.
James,
And yes,
can you explain what is real property?
real property is anything you can walk on. It's real estate, houses, land. That's real property. Deeded property, any property that has ownership by means of a deed would be considered real property. Personal property is everything else. So if you own a car, that's personal property. If you own a boat, that's personal property. If you own a collection of different things, whatever you might be collecting, that's personal property. But real property is only that's registered and has a deed. The reason why that's required is because you do it now. Starting in about 1940 in the United States, there was somebody, and I don't remember the guy's name, but somebody decided they'd write a book about how to avoid probate. And they thought of this very interesting idea that there were things called trusts, and that the trust was self-executing. In other words, the trust owned the property. The trust was not a entity that could die. And so if a person put his or her assets into a trust, then that trust would avoid probate. Well, the idea there was that they would avoid the extortionately large fees being levied on estates. Well, yeah, back in those days, it was pretty bad. So there was some real reasons for having that. The trust thing went through all sorts of iterations. And today it's fairly common for a family of reasonable means to have a trust that would transfer their property. Is that going to avoid litigation? Is that going to avoid the costs? Depends on the family. It always depends on the family. So just to kind of emphasize this, that legal language is extremely conservative. I mean, extremely conservative. There's been movements for as long as I've been aware of the law, for about the last 70 years, to try to get it changed, and it just resists it. The reason is that once a court reviews certain language, then they are going to use that language always in the future. And then they'll make sure everyone else uses that same language. So it's just easier for the world to work if the language is always very similar and very clear. What you're going to find is that a will written in the 1700s, even the 1600s, contains some of the same language as one written in the 1900s. Now, if we're getting into the 2000s in the 20th century, you may find some very kind of variations on it because people are trying to do all sorts of things. Now, the wills are most likely found in conjunction with the probate files in the county records in the United States. Okay, so where are you going to find them? You're going to find them under probate. And sometimes they have, like the books we were working with were books at about 2 feet by 3 feet in size and about 2 inches thick that weighed close to 45 pounds. And those books were huge. You open them up, and then we would be digitizing the pages from those huge books. And that was real heavy. Boy, they were difficult to work with. And sometimes the probate files have wills in one book and probates in another, and the rest of the probate things that happen in other parts. So here's all of the probates. Now, to get into the details of the probate and the value, all of the probate records have value for genealogical purposes because they deal with people, they deal with specific events, and they deal with usually specific items of property. And so they just are very, very helpful. Some of the large genealogical websites have extensive wills and probate files from across the country. The good news. Bad news is very few of these yet are indexed. So you're not going to see a lot of indexes, and they're going to have to search them page by page. And there's two major problems that occur in genealogical situations. One is some courts would take the estate file for one person or individual and put all the documents in one set of documents. In other words, when you got the probate, you got the entire probate, the will, and all of the actions that happened in the court. And other ones just did them as they came in chronologically. So you have a document, and then 2 years later, you have another document, and then 5 years later, you have another document, and then so forth. So it's not, they're not as easy. In any case, when we have what's happening with artificial intelligence and handwriting recognition, is that these will be eventually processed and become extremely valuable too. And they've already started that because some of those probate records are now available through artificial intelligence on the familysearch.org labs website, LABS. As we go back in time, their probate files and wills, and the availability of wills is more common. The reason being that was what I said a few moments ago, and that was that the states today exempt people from the whole process. They don't want somebody in there with $75 worth of assets in the court and use up all the judge's time and the attorney's time going through something that has no value in a sense to the court. So they try to set the levels, I think, at times just simply to avoid having all the little tiny cases. Now, what I'm saying about historically is that all those little tiny cases still went to court back. If you go back, it's just sort of uniformly going back, you see more and smaller and smaller and smaller probate cases, meaning smaller amounts of property. So there's a lot more value because you get more people involved in the probate process. Okay, so one of the things you might be upset about is that the language is pretty bad and the handwriting is atrocious, but a problem, but the language is important. And because it's so important that if you get confused on the language, then you may mistake somebody in the will or whatever as to their relationship to the person making the will, the testator. And I've seen that confusion happen because the language is pretty, at first, seems to be somewhat impenetrable. So let me just kind of give you some idea that you are not alone. This is the ASU, Arizona State University, Armstrong Hall, about 1975 while I was in law school. This is where I went to law school. I had started working at the law school before my first semester. So law schools generally take about 3 years of classes. If you do them all summer and all winter and ever keep going, which by the way is a good way to get your health ruined, you can get through earlier. I managed to get through in 2.5 years and get through with my coursework. Didn't speed up when I got accepted into the bar because I still had to take what they call the bar exam. Okay, so what happened? Well, I had worked in libraries previously while I was an undergraduate and graduate student at the University of Utah. I'd continually worked in the library. And I had worked in an area called bibliography, which gives people, if you can work as a bibliographer, you get to know everything about the library. And basically, I came in about 3 months early before the term started, my first term, and got the job as a reference librarian in the library here at ASU Law Library. And so I worked as a reference librarian at the desk, handling all the stuff, the books that were on not circulating and those kinds of things, plus telling people where to find things. And it is a matter of fact, I had not an extensive, but I had a significant legal background because my father was an attorney, because I was involved in the law as a teenager, as not getting arrested, not that kind of involvement. I was involved in a legal explorer post back when the Boy Scouts of America had those such things. So, we went to court and we heard trials and things. And I watched a lot of Perry Mason, so I must have gotten a little bit of law in there. Anyway, this was the first day of law school, and I was working at the reference desk in the law library. And as soon as the first class ended, there was like this thundering herd, mass of students pouring out of the large classrooms and into the library, grabbing books, fighting away, trying to get some information on trying to understand what the professor had said during the preceding hour. That was pretty much the same thing that happened for about the first couple of months of law school until they finally got wise and went out and got their own copies of the books, of the dictionary books and things. This is, of course, before computers and before iPads and iPhones and all that kind of stuff. So no place to look stuff up except the library. So unless you have a legal background, you'll likely need to treat wills if they were written in a foreign language. And it may take just about the same amount of effort as it would if you were learning a language you did not know. So you're going to have to pick out almost every other word and the way they're said and understand what they mean by that and what that is. And that will get you. But once you do this, by the way, this is like you get a tremendous benefit out of it, because once you do that, you're going to be finding wills, and they're going to be, and you're going to see how these families worked. You're going to be able to see whole families. And you may be able to say, no, they didn't have 8 kids. They only had 4 kids. And the will doesn't show that they had any more children. And so all these other children are somebody else's. All those things that happen when you're doing genealogical research are going to be buttressed by having interest in your ability will. So fortunately for all of us, there's a free way to learn definitions. It's called Black's Law Dictionary. It's online for free. It is available in print forms, and there are different ways to get there. There's a Black's Law Dictionary in archive.org. That's a free digital version online. There's also the whole second edition law dictionary. Now, there's like 17 editions of this thing or something like that, of the law dictionary, but it's just because there's new terms and new terms and new terms. But if you're doing historical research, this second edition is going to be just as helpful as anything. So you'll begin to get some idea. And the definitions, sometimes you have to do what's called string reading. You read the definition and half the words in the definition, you can't read half the words in you don't understand what the words in the definition are. So then you have to go to the next is looking up all those words, and then you'll have to look up all the other words. Anyway, it turns into a process of learning a lot about whatever subject you're looking at. But it's free. I mean, you can do it whenever you want. In some cases, you can download the book and read it, keep it. So here's the key. I would suggest strongly that you work back systematically looking for the wills of your ancestors. If you can find the wills for these people, you're going to be able to validate the families. You're going to be able to say, yes, this was the family. Now, if you don't have a will, then that doesn't really, it may be either difficult or next to impossible to find the wills because they were either destroyed or whatever. But on the other hand, to those people who were here in the United States and preceding colonies, they probably had wills, and if they had any kind of assets in England, they probably had a will. But like I said, it's only thing for people who had a sufficient amount of property to justify it or own the property themselves. And here's where it's the big problem here is skipping generations can cause a great deal of confusion. If you try to do that, if you say, oh, well, everything here is I've got all this known, I know this is all correct, and you go back 4 or 5 generations and start in on people, unless you know and have worked your way through and read the sources and know what how each one of these people has been put into your lineage, especially on the family search family tree with all of the shared and communal way of it being handled, you really are going to run into some kind of real problems because all of a sudden you'll find out that who you're working with isn't the person you thought you were working with. That's just kind of what happens out there.
James,
Yes.
there's a question in the chat. It says, when did women begin to have wills in England?
That's a good question. The question is that did women have probate? Did women have wills? The answer is yes. The women owned what's called the dower rights, and going back in English law and U.S. law. And if the husband died and they ended up with their interest in the property, which was usually 1/3 of the property shared with the children, and not that they shared their 1/3, the other 2/3 went to the children, and they died and they still owned the property, then there was a probate and they had wills. And when we were doing the wills in Maryland, in the various counties, it was kind of interesting to see all the women's wills. There were lots of them, so it's not something that didn't happen. That's just a kind of a let's say it's one of those views of the role of women in the past that it got a little bit excessive there when they think that they never had anything. They just tell them. You always hear how the husband owned all the property. That's true. It was all in the name of the husband. But then the women had their dower right, what they brought to the property, and which was sometimes considerable. And there had to be a disposition of that at some time. So the important thing, this will I've got up here, last will and testament of OVC Ovison lists all the children in detail. And so, and all some of the grandchildren. So this is really an interesting one that tells a lot. And I said, of course, you'll have to learn to read the handwriting. This is really good handwriting. But interesting thing is with the will books and what you're reading in court, they're probably not written by the testator. And the easiest way to see that is to look at a bunch of wills in succession. And if they all come out with the same handwriting, then you know that they were just copied into the will book. And we were kind of discussing when I was going through this as to whether or not they hauled these books around and let the people write it in their own handwriting. But in the case of OVC Ovison, he was a direct immigrant from Denmark. I don't know how much English he knew, and I would be very surprised that he could have written this will, but that's possible.
Hey, James, there's another question from Robert. He wants to know, generally, where are most wills found?
Counties. They're in the counties. Probate files. You might find a few on the state, but not often. They're always in the counties in the United States and England. They would have been handled by the parishes and the establishment. So depending on where you go to look for wills in other countries, you may have to do some research just to find out where they are and where they might be kept and whether they're accessible at all. So even though there may be difficulty in reading a will, they're all in the same format. So it's pretty easy to say, oh yeah, that scribble right there probably means being of sound mind and etc. So that would be the way that they would look at a will. Now, the good thing about some of these will files is that for their own purposes, the court would often put together an index of each book in the front or in the back, not sometimes depending. And it's not unusual for those indexes to be produced. Sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what pages they were talking about. Sometimes the pages have been renumbered, or there's all sorts of things, believe me, when you get into these. But basically what's happening is that there's a little bit of hope finding things a little bit quicker. Now, what about contests? Yes, people come in and argue and fight and spend a long time. I keep remembering the times like the day I spent the afternoon talking to one of the attorneys in his office while the two clients were in the other room screaming at each other about the teaspoons, the set of teaspoons. Okay. So, that's kind of goes along with the territory. But if they were contested, why was that good? It's good for attorneys. It's good for genealogists. The reason is that the more they fight, the more information they put into court and the longer the probates. Some probates are like 3 or 4 pages. Some probates I run into are hundreds of pages long. You can imagine how much information about the family is in that. And some of these probates, they're not something that happens quickly. The person may die and they may have a probate maybe in the next 6 months or 8 months or a year or even longer, because they never thought they'd have to sell their property, and then they go to sell their property and find out that they have to go back and probate it from the original person who owned it when they died. And then the probate in that case may be handled for, like the one I found here in Provo, Utah, that went on for 30 years before it was closed. With a lot of information. So just to kind of let you know, we have about 8 videos on the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel about wills, and those are also on the Family History Library Family History Center's website. So keep learning. It usually takes an effort, takes time. And thanks for watching.